And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. It's my privilege today to have back on the podcast Professor Mark Eckel. Mark, how are you doing today?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me on.
And for those that are our podcast listeners for some time, you know that Professor Eckel joined us on episode number 113, talking about how Christians should engage politics. If you're interested in public theology and apologetics, I've really enjoyed that conversation, kind of diving into that topic. So Professor Eckel actually has a very eclectic career. Wanted to have him back on today to talk about a new project that he's launched, but just a little bit of the background, bit of his background. He's the president of the Comenius Institute, a nonprofit organization that helps equip Christians worldview thinking. He also works at IUPUI, which would be Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. So he's there in a secular university scene, but also teaches at Indianapolis Theological Seminary, Capital Seminary. As I mentioned, he wears a lot of hats, but I think has a very unique perspective of being in the church, but also being in academia and navigating all that's going on in our culture. So looking forward to thinking through how Christians can respond to marginalization. So as we get started, Mark, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a bit of an update for those that may not have met you before, a little bit about your work, and then dive into what led you to start markeckel.com.
Sure. So my interest is always in the public square, Christians having a voice in the public square. Now, how Christians have a voice in the public square, that's a whole discussion.
Sure.
One of the words that I use on a regular basis is the word approach. It really does matter how you approach individuals and groups and institutions. And my view of doing this is very arenic, which means peaceable. And my focus is always to serve the university. And honestly, my focal point really comes out of 1 Peter 2:13-17, where we are to not only obey the authorities, but respect them. And then, of course, to honor the king, to honor those who are in jurisdiction over us within whatever precincts we find ourselves in. And I suppose I should also say, having said that I think it's important for everybody to understand where my theological, political connections meet. And I just wanted to say this up front before we talk about anything else, and that is that I am what I would refer to as a perennial preservatist. Now, some people call themselves progressive, some people call themselves conservative, some people call themselves libertarians. I'm very interested in these two words because of what they mean. So the word perennial means that it's like perennial flowers. They come up consistently year by year, and you can count on the fact that they're going to be there. So for me, I'm a perennial thinker because I believe in the great ideas and ideals that have been handed down to us throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, beginning, of course, with the Pentateuch and Moses. But I'm also a preservatist. I've begun to adopt that word because other words, such as conservative, have taken on such a negative connotation in the culture at large. Because what I believe about Christian life is that I am here to preserve that which has been given to me. So I believe that, let's say, for instance, about literature, I believe that I need to preserve those things that have been given to me and the great books and ideas that have been handed down to us. But my responsibility is also to preserve very important ideas that are pillars for our culture. So I, without hesitation, say I'm pro-life and I am pro-freedom. I believe that we should take care of babies in the womb. They are humans, and this is a very powerful and important and essential issue for us as Christians. But also that I'm pro-freedom. That means that I believe everybody should have a voice, and everybody's voice should be protected. And the reason for the First Amendment to the Constitution is so important to us as Americans. So one of the great tensions that I face is that of an American Christian. I struggle sometimes with how do I respond as a Christian in my culture. I want to preserve the freedoms that have been given to me for my children and grandchildren, and at the same time recognize, according to 1 Peter, within the state of persecution, that might not always be a possibility. Which then leads me to talk about markeckel.com, which was started because I wanted to make sure that I could put in one place my teaching, specifically beginning with worldview evaluation and teaching, so that the church could have a video platform where they could go and find 3 to 6 minute videos where they could be instructed on one basic concept in worldview or in doctrine or in theology. Right now, for instance, I'm doing a series on Never Let Them See You Coming, which is on teaching. So that's an essential concept for me as an educator. How do you teach people so that they will listen? But I wanted markeckel.com to be a place where everybody could go. It's a subscription-based service, I should mention. So when you go to markeckel.com, you'll see that. You can sign up, that kind of thing. But my point in doing this is for churches to give them a strong soil within which to grow deep theological roots, which I think are going to be imperative for us now and into the future in the American church.
So we discussed this a little bit before we jumped on. Of course, one of the biggest stories in the apologetics kind of / worldview space is the fall of Ravi Zacharias, the stories that came out. And like probably most Christians, you see a lot of these accusations. It's sometimes difficult to filter through what actually happened, but then you have independent reports that brought just very clear evidence of what had happened. And so Ravi Zacharias seemed to be kind of the largest figure, international figure in this space. And so with Ravi's fall, where do you see kind of the worldview apologetic space going? Does that kind of shift back to the local church? And it seems like you may be trying to fill a little bit of that as well. So I'd just be interested in kind of what happens to that apologetic space now.
I'm always reminded of what scripture says. I'm thinking about Elijah, of course, who meets Obadiah, and when Obadiah tells him, there are 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. There are many people doing great work within any field as Christians. So whether you're talking about science or history or literature, it really doesn't matter. There are really great Christians doing really good work. There will be people who come to the fore and have been doing so already that will make a difference in terms of filling the gaps, as it were. I don't know that that emphasis is going to shift or change, and I'm thinking nationally, internationally. It's always a sadness to see these kinds of events and specifically within the church. But speaking of the church, I think it's really important for us to help people understand that no matter what field they are in, they are apologists. So you're an apologist if you're teaching literature. You're an apologist if you're teaching science or history or any of the other disciplines. You're an apologist in architecture. You're an apologist in sociology. We could go on and on. My point in emphasizing this is that every single discipline is to be defended Christianly. That is, that we are thinking Christianly about all things. And so I do think it's incumbent upon the local church to actually establish these ties so that people within the church, that is, folks that are showing up on a Sunday, understand that their vocation, no matter who they are, no matter what they do, is important because they've been gifted by God. But to have that preservativist approach within the culture itself so that they might have a tremendous impact as salt and light in the culture. So short answer is yes, all of this ought to go back to local church. The megachurch emphasis or the celebrity culture, we really need to move past and beyond and by that as a church. We really need to have strong local congregations.
That's encouraging. And certainly one thought is the kingdom is bigger than any of us. And even
Yes.
as Esther was told that, deliverance is going to rise from another place if you don't step up for the moment. So we're just one piece of God's kingdom moving forward, and we should be mindful of that. But then, just looking at maybe one figure to actually disciple people. And I've even looking at a state like Indiana where we are, the difference in somebody, say, in urban Indy and in rural Jefferson County where I live, and how I would approach them in the gospel. So the local pastor is actually going to be kind of the chief apologist, I think, that is supposed to be equipping the saints. And certainly we can have national voices that can assist with that. But I think that was perhaps one important reminder of this as well, is that, look, that's, to your point, that is the local church's job. And we can have some assistance from other voices, but shouldn't lose that emphasis. That's helpful. So you wrote a post recently that I noticed and I thought was really helpful. We had a podcast episode a couple weeks back on how to respond to the blitz. That did have a little bit to do with worldview and posture, a good bit to do with kind of what's happening legally, politically. Your post focused almost on kind of a felt response and an internal response from the church. And so you had kind of 10 points of how to respond to marginalization. I'd love to have you kind of go through them at length on this podcast episode. I'm just anticipating a few comments from those that might be listening. So first of all, is the church really even being marginalized? Is going to be the question. Are we kind of raising an alarm when that's not actually happening? I'll pass this to you here in just a second. So my basic thought about marginalization is, certainly at least we could recognize that Christian ideas and perhaps Christian institutions are being marginalized. I think of what happened with Oral Roberts University during the NCAA tournament. Oh, you're a Christian institution that holds to a Christian viewpoint on human sexuality. You have no place in March Madness, was at least one opinion. So I don't know that there'd be much argument with Christian ideas are being marginalized, maybe our institutions. I would say that, but then I would also say that Christian individuals, as a whole, our Christian evangelicals or evangelical Christians being kind of booted out of mainstream American society at this point. No, and so I'm not trying to, say like Chicken Little, the sky's falling. So trying to say, yes, there's a problem without making it sound too grave. But then how do we respond to this moment? So how would you kind of frame up marginalization and what's happening in culture right now?
I would remind everybody that it wasn't but a couple of months ago that Stanford University professors tried to shut down the Heritage Foundation. And I think it's important to recognize that kind of statement, because in the university setting, which is one of the great influencers in our culture, there is truly a marginalization of the Christian voice. And in the Heritage Foundation, we're not talking about specifically a Christian voice, but we are speaking there about a libertarian conservative voice that does really good research. And of course, there are those that want to silence those kinds of voices. I do believe that that is happening and see it on a regular basis because I'm in the public square. I see it happening at the university level. However, at the same time, I would say that it's the reason why I went back to get another degree at IUPUI, so that I could be there and teach in the university and have a voice there. And that has been a progenitor of respect. And I think establishing foundations for Christians within the university itself. This isn't about me. This is about making sure that we have an opportunity to actually speak to issues that are really prominent and important to us. So do I think that the marginalization is happening? Well, sure. I mean, honestly, anybody who's thinking about what's happening around them needs to understand that these kinds of events are taking place. I would add, however, that if you're only listening to NPR and reading the New York Times and the Washington Post, then you have no idea of other alternative sources. Or if you do, those kinds of sources are always going to malign or downplay or literally ignore news that comes out from other vantage points that speaks to a different voice. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, and I'll give a shout out to the Heterodox Academy. It's one of the reasons why I became a member of the Heterodox Academy, so that I might be able to say, yes, I believe in viewpoint diversity. There's one kind of diversity we need on the university campus. It is that viewpoint diversity. So do I think that we should abide by the Chicken Little approach? Absolutely not. No, we need to get out there and do something about this. I mean, it's the reason why you do what you do. And it's also the reason why I do what I do. So we are invested wherever it is that we find ourselves. So let me get to those 10 points.
Well, before
I really think that a lot of this was generated by my reading of Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies. I came to chapter 9. Well, I'll back up and say in markeckel.com, I actually reviewed these chapters one at a time. So I was reviewing chapters 1 through 10 in his book, and you can find that there. And within the framework of reading this and reviewing it and thinking myself about it, by the unction of the Spirit, I was given these 10 points. So here they are. I'll kind of fill them out as I go, and feel free to interrupt anytime.
Mark, I did want to jump in. Something you mentioned, and if you're watching the video, I'm in a room there where the lights go out from time to time, so because I'm not moving enough, I guess. So if you see me like waving my arms, I'm not trying to make a TikTok video. So a couple of things you mentioned. First, one of the reasons I wanted to have you address this topic is you're in a sense a living example of this tension, because you're ministering in a space where many biblical principles would be questioned, and yet, and that's why I encourage listeners to go back and listen to podcast episode number 113, where you told a lot of stories about ministering to students, ministering to professors, not in an underhanded way. You're just a Christian in that space. And so I think even just your position is a helpful example of trying to manage this tension as we move forward. You mentioned the Heterodox Academy. For anyone that's not familiar with that, would you explain a little bit of that effort?
Sure. So there has been a concerted effort by some who have seen that there are voices that are being marginalized. That's what we're talking about here. They're being marginalized because they are not the accepted narrative within the university setting. So some came about this from various angles, some who were already a libertarian conservative approach, some who had been progressive liberal and said, you know what, I'm not hearing any of these voices, I wonder why, and then began this institution. I would just encourage everybody that's listening to go to check out, do a Bing search on the Heterodox Academy and find out what's happening there. I actually emphasize this to my students, and I tell them, full disclosure, I'm a member of this academy, but I do so because they don't get to hear these kinds of things from their professors, quite honestly, in the university setting. So thank you for emphasizing the fact that, yeah, we try to live by example. I'm an academic, I'm in the university, this is what we do. But there is a sense in which that the core of who I am as a Christian, it just kind of bleeds into everything. And it bleeds into my talk, into my conversations with faculty. And they're always very generous, though they become quite not divisive or heated, but we stand our ground on whatever side that we're on.
Sure.
But I'm glad to offer the voice in the university.
Excellent. So if you would, those 10 points, certainly
Yes.
recommend Live Not by Lies if the listener hasn't read it, which kind of looks at Russian dissidents and how they handled the Soviet state and still standing up for truth. But again, I found these 10 points very helpful if you would jump into those.
Sure. So number one, small groups combined to create a strong bond. Small groups combined to create a strong bond. So I always think about the epistles that went out from Paul or Peter or John, and they went to these vast areas of Asia, for instance. And then they were passed along from city to city, from house church to house church. And those groups were brought together by these writings. I think that's really crucial for us. Even in a digital age, it's even easier for us now to do those kinds of things. But when the digital approach perhaps collapses, and that's a real possibility, another discussion point perhaps, the local geographical churches that have the same kind of belief system are going to be crucial and need to have strong bonds. Second is courage, is knowing who or what to fear. I'll say that again. My definition for courage is knowing who or what to fear. So when I think about this, I'm immediately taken by Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10. Don't fear the person who can kill the body, but fear the one who can kill both body and soul. The courage issue is knowing what and who to fear, because my focus isn't about fearing my government or fearing confiscation of weapons or anything like this, though, I would take issue with any of these kinds of things. My point is about the courage that it's going to be a Christian within this framework, within this cultural moment. Number three is spreading the word makes a louder voice. Spreading the word makes a louder voice. So one of the reasons why I've been on social media for ages, for decades now, is because I believe that it has a strong voice, that is, social media does, and that the more that I can give consistency to my voice on my platforms, the more people may become convinced by something or at least become exposed to it. I've had tremendous opportunities for conversations, some of them adversarial, but nonetheless, I think in encouraging Christians to live by the book that they say they believe in. Number four is that patience is a strategy. And by that, I mean, I'm really convinced that we don't have much of that in the United States of America. We are so focused on the clock. We are so focused on the next digital movement of the second hand. This is a sadness to me. You're hearing somebody struggle with this because I'm the kind of guy who wants everything yesterday. I mean, I'm like everybody else. So I'm not a very patient person, but I also recognize that the Soviet Union fell after 70 years because people were praying behind the Eastern Bloc wall. So I'm taken then back to Egypt, where the Israelites were there for 400 years and crying out to God. So patience is a strategy. I think that's something that we need to consider. Number five, I think we need to find goodwill allies, one in spirit, if not in doctrine. Find goodwill allies, one in spirit, if not in doctrine. So I have a number of friends at the university who are not Christians, but who are my friends and who ally themselves with the ideas that we commit to together. A number of these friends are students, and they have become friends over the years. And this is, I think, an important idea to emphasize the need for discipleship within whatever venue we might find ourselves in, especially vocationally. I would also add that you shouldn't just find allies with people that just agree with you 100%. You'll never find those people. Sure. I'm here to tell you. I'm thinking about a Robert P. George, for instance. I really look up to Professor George at Princeton, a great Catholic scholar. I am not Catholic. I am PCA Presbyterian, very different in our ecclesiology. But I'll tell you what, Robert P. George holds the line in terms of jurisprudence and every other basic baseline doctrine that I hold dear and that are essential, let's say, for instance, to the Apostles' Creed. So we're not going to always agree, but you need to find those allies. Number six, grieving with others is better than grieving alone. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to, a couple comments on these. These are really, really helpful. Sure. So we're talking before we jumped on, just a concern about the state of the church. You know, it isn't so much the vigor, the pressure that's coming against the church, kind of the vigor of the enemies of the church, because the church has always had enemies, right? But it's the state of the church that's concerning. Here comes this kind of tsunami of cultural forces, and for many Christians, it seems like their faith is about an inch deep, you know? And so the challenge, I think, for church leaders, other committed Christians that want to see the gospel go forward is, how do you change that? How do you move it forward? So the first one on kind of small groups combined, creating a strong bond, it seems to be an encouragement to a number of churches that through COVID realized, well, church isn't just real estate. We've got to dive deep into building Christian community, to growing small groups. So I sense that that's something that a lot of churches are doing. But number two strikes me as, knowing who or what to fear. That's a problem for perhaps all of us, where we see culture changing, but we actually need to really focus on God. And so, what are some things that Christians fear that perhaps they shouldn't fear as much as they do?
I don't think Christians should fear LGBTQ+. I think what we ought to do is we ought to just simply love people. We ought to care about people. I'm often thoughtful about this because, at the university, public university campus, I have all kinds of different students there. Just to give you an example of this, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a Zoom meeting with a young woman who was asking me about the meaning of life. and really concerned about this. But her whole beginning, the whole prologue and preamble to what she had to say was about her being Latina. Well, I encouraged her in her heritage and promoted who she is as a person and her family and all of this. Uh, and I said, I view you and care about you and am concerned for you as a human person. The first thing I think about is not your ethnicity, not your nationality, not your linguistic heritage, but about who you are as a person. I think Christians have a tendency, because there's so much that it's so loud in the culture about, let's say, for instance, Black Lives Matter, diversity issues, LGBTQ plus, all of these things are just, as you well say, a tsunami in terms of cultural influence. But I'm not afraid of any of those things. And it's not because of me, it's because of the one who lives within me, who gives me the courage to say, these things are passing. My concern has never changed, that I love people, that I care for people, that I do my job well. This is a crucial issue for all of us, to do our job well with excellence. So just to give, those are just a few examples. I could go on and on here. You can tell I get preaching every once in a while.
No, I think that's helpful. It's certainly mindful of legal challenges to ministries, and we need to take appropriate steps there. But just that sense of fear, hesitancy in this particular cultural moment, especially for Christians that spend a lot of time kind of in the Christian bubble, having to step out of that and just take a breath. There have been challenges to the gospel all along. This is just another version of it. And I think as maybe the veneer of this, all of these cultural changes wears off a little bit, and people are like, oh, finding my identity in a particular lifestyle, a particular movement, it hasn't solved the angst. It hasn't filled the hole. And that's where Christians, I think, can step in and give the good news of the gospel. So spreading the word makes a louder voice. So certainly we should be on social. We should be sharing these things. I think the challenge for most Christians is you go to post something about scripture, especially on one of these more contested topics, and it's like, do I want to raise my flag in a sense, and then get a whole bunch of stuff thrown at me? So you're in a unique position to be able to share biblical truths with students, to talk to other professors, and so I'm sure that thought has crossed your mind once or twice. So how do you deal with that? As you are, I need to go promote these biblical principles, but yet I'm still teaching at a public university. So how do you deal with that?
Boy, I'm just out there. I mean, everybody knows who I am. I mean, I can tell by conversations I have with faculty members that I haven't had conversations with before, just by the things that they say, that they've already been pre-programmed by who Mark Eckel is. So the word spreads quickly. I think it's important to realize that when you have all the degrees and more that your colleagues have, that you publish as much or more than they do, and you teach with them, that there's a respect that grows because of that. And that's one of the reasons why we're there. But at the same time, I have these great opportunities to just be clearly Christian. Social media is a platform that everybody accesses, and they know exactly who I am, exactly what I believe. Now, does that mean that everybody has to be like that? No. I mean, you have to find your niche to find where you're going to have the loudest voice and the best voice for who you are and what you do. It's one of the reasons why I don't post much political stuff, because that's not what I want to be known for. I mean, that's a crucial concern for me. As much as I might have strong, very strong political views, I don't want to be known for that.
And this kind of cuts back to Roger's book about whatever culture throws at you. I mean, you're still going about your life. You're trying to deal with it, raise kids, have a job. But the one thing you say, I'm going to draw a line in the sand and say, I will not live by lies. And as a Christian, most people probably have you pegged as that anyway. And so you not speaking up on the issue, sometimes they probably just scratch their head like, well, if you really believe the Bible, wouldn't you say something about this? So I think that's just an encouragement to all of us to continue to spread the good news. The patience strategy, and I'll move on here for sake of time, but it's certainly something we talk a lot about here on the podcast, looking at 2050. What can we get done in 30 years? As part of the microwave generation, or even worse at this point, like microwave's not fast enough. Um, that's certainly something that I wrestle with. And then finding those goodwill allies is huge. Do you have any advice for somebody that wants to build that type of relationship where they're not hitting on 100% theologically? Maybe they're even a person of a different faith. How have you reached out? Any pointers on how Christians could do that?
I think you need to find social groups that might be an encouragement to you, for instance. Uh, One of the things that we did with Comenius was we had a radio show for 4 years. And that radio show, 60% of our guests were Black. And that was very intentional. My producer, H.B. Bell, African American, we're very close. He calls me his white twin, mostly because we just think alike. This is powerfully important when people see you and see you with Black brothers and sisters. And I'm just picking this as one example. To be in a social gathering, a social group of people who matter in every way that that might be said. Now, some of the folks listening to this might be saying, well, I'm really into, let's say, Second Amendment issues, or I like to go out and shoot. Great. Find a social group that of folks who might have some similar ideas that you might have. But be wary that those ideas might be extreme in some senses and in some cases. But I do believe that the social cultural opportunities that are available to us, even going to a jazz music evening on Sunday evenings over the last couple of months, I've gone to hear Reggie Foster play sax down at the Havana Cigar Bar. I mean, I love jazz and I love to listen to Reggie play. It's fantastic music. I'm going to meet different people there. I'm going to have different experiences there. I'm going to find some camaraderie there. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with everybody 100%. I find common ground with the people that I can find it with.
That's helpful. That's helpful. So those were the first five. What's 6 through 10?
So grieving with others is better than grieving alone. If you are, and I think this is one of the benefits of social media, actually, if you are being ostracized or marginalized or set aside for whatever reason, there are going to be a lot of people out there that have had similar experiences, and getting together with those individuals not only is a comfort, but also an encouragement to go forward and continue. So I do think that our lament over what is happening in a culture is an important investment, no matter what anybody else says about whether or not we should lament or should not lament. I do think that when you're losing something that's important to you, that loss is something that should be recognized, and that's not to be taken lightly. Number 7, create spaces of shared purpose. You and I are doing that right now. Anybody listening to this podcast is doing that right now. Anybody who finds encouragement in any kind of biblical teaching or intersection of cultural investment in a Hebraic Christian viewpoint is doing that. We have a shared purpose, you and I, and our shared purpose is to have a voice in the public square. Now, we're going about that differently because we have different responsibilities and opportunities, and that's good. But we should find that purpose with each other, and I think it's a wonderful thing that we get to do that even in this way, digitally right now.
Yeah.
So digital friends are great, but local friends are greater is number 8. And what I mean by that is the day may come when big tech decides that they're going to eliminate all of us who don't agree with them. So you've seen some suspensions, you've seen some eliminations of various high level individuals, not only in government, but in culture. And they've literally been ripped off of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. You'll find that YouTube videos that come up about certain issues are immediately taken down as soon as the YouTube, I'll use this word specifically, overlords decide that somehow This is something that goes against the narrative, and that's exactly what's going on. Now, folks on my progressive left are not going to be happy about me saying those things, but my word, I could give them example after example of this stuff going on. I say all of that to say it's much better to have friends in a geographical location, close knit, because the day may come when social media is no longer something that we can rely upon. I think about that because I'm one of those people that's thinking 20 years ahead and wondering what might come of this moment and what might become of us in the future. So that's what I mean by local friends are more important. So that goes back to the local church. Number 9, dissent against what matters most. So to me, what matters most are life issues. So you will hear my voice unequivocally about pro-life issues. Some of the people who disagree with me most heartily will write to me on social media about this, and I'll tell them, look, we're diametrically opposed on these issues. I know where you're coming from, you know where I'm coming from, but I'm not giving you an inch on this. This is paramount to me, just as much as when I speak out about big tech freedom issues. And just as an aside here, I really get tired of Twitter is a business and they can have people on there that they want to have. Give me a break. I mean, seriously, this is unbelievably off the board. We have come to assume social media as a powerful component of our culture. And when you have people who say that they have rules and standards and don't delineate what those are and do arbitrarily take people off of them, this is what really makes me upset. You can tell the timbre of my voice.
Sure.
It makes me upset because this is what I have been grown into an American culture of freedom. And as I said earlier, I want to pass that freedom on. And I have atheist friends and Muslim friends, and I want them to have freedom to speak as well. When you begin to eliminate people, you're going to hear my voice about that. So that's what I mean about dissent against that which matters most. Those two things, I raised those again. And number 10, deep roots of belief weather storm. We've all heard the famous lines about the oak tree that has deep roots. On the top of the mountain is the tree that's going to survive the storm. And by deep roots, I mean deep theological roots. It's, again, one of the reasons why I started markeckel.com, for one place where I could dig deep into theology and the practical application of theology, I might add, for everybody to understand how this is relating to all of life, but a place where we could dig deep roots together. And this, I think, is the responsibility and role of the local church, pastors and elders who need to do teaching that gets their people ready, not only for the daily life that they face, their vocations and so on, but also for what might be around the corner, what might come in the future. And anticipating that by teaching books like First Peter in the Bible that prepare people for being aliens and strangers in the world.
So these are all helpful, and as I did with the first 5, I'll have just a few thoughts here. And for those of you that are listening, don't worry, we'll have these listed in the show notes, so you don't have to try to dictate them into your phone or take a note. But that idea of grieving with others is better than grieving alone. I sometimes have some pushback on the podcast because I'll talk about, is America Jerusalem or is it Babylon, and some of these cultural changes. And so I'll say this, for anyone that's listening, I think this would be true for you, Mark, as well. Don't mistake, recognition of cultural change as a celebration of cultural change. I mourn these things. I wish the United States was moving towards biblical principles, but I think if you just look at the news, it's not. And so, how do we deal with reality? I believe we're supposed to be people that looks at what is true, what is right in front of us, and deal with that reality rather than kind of wistfully looking at the past. So that's helpful, and just processing these things with you here today, I find helpful. Creating spaces of shared purpose. I'm grateful for podcasts and even again, kind of coming back to the local church and how the local church can play a role with doing that, as well as providing those local friends. And something we mentioned on the podcast is, most Christians will have their greatest impact in their own zip code. And reading Roger's book about how all of these different Christian groups were localized, and were doing work over the course of years and ended up making a huge change. Dissenting against what matters most. This one certainly resonates with me. So how could you help Christians, and even, I'm asking this question for myself as well. How do we choose in between what's a battle to fight, and then what's one to lament and note and work against, but not to act as if it's the end of the republic or the end of the Christian church? So any tips on discerning what's a huge issue and what's not?
Well, let me begin a response to that question by laying a foundational statement and helping people to remember that the Second Testament, the New Testament, was written during a period of time of totalitarian dictatorship. The Roman Empire was not, velvet glove emperors here. These folks, if they didn't like what you had to say, you were eliminated. So understand that the Second Testament, the New Testament, was written within that framework. Jesus lived during that framework. Paul, John, Peter writing in that framework. So all of what we're thinking about here, we need to think differently, because this is what our Lord endured. This is what the apostles had to deal with. And I won't even get into the First Testament on this and the prophets. But my point in emphasizing this is that we have the recipe for us right in front of us for how we ought to respond. Now, to what issues are most important to us? Let's just make this very simple and go to, I'm supposed to love God and love my neighbor. And of course, I demonstrate my love of God by my love for my neighbor. What is it that is so important in the life of any given individual person or group? I could go down a list of things, but let me start with the family. The government is not the solution to the widespread disability, moral disability that we see. The solution is the family. That should be the first bulwark against the difficulties that anybody sees. So I have students writing papers right now who consistently say, well, the government, the government, the government. And I'm responding, the family, the family, the family. And I'm also responding and telling them that the government has no money. And I take out my wallet and show them, this is the government's money right here. So we need to recognize that family is important. We need to recognize that the economy is important. And this is not something that people talk a lot about. They'll love to take their checks and go cash them, government checks and so on. But when we talk about economics, we're talking about really the future of not only our children, but our grandchildren. And this is where, and if you really want to get some substance to this, we need to begin to read the two great Black economists, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell. And in that, we find the essential components for stable, ordered economy. And I emphasize stable and ordered because I believe that there's an economic system that functions best. So I would say family, economics is truly important. Our vocations are important. So standing up for those who cannot speak for themselves. If people are being marginalized in the vocation, let's say, for instance, somebody is involved in a right to work dispute with unions. That person's ability to work is an issue of freedom. We should stand for those individuals and for those people. When I think about vocations, I'm concerned about how people are being left out of certain vocations. And I, again, come back to this young woman I spoke with. She said she was fired. This was her experience and her testimony, that she had been fired for standing up for a Black man who had come into the hospital. Now, I don't know the details of any of that, but anything that we have responsibility for, that we can speak to or stop or inhibit the discriminatory practices of whomever, we ought to be the first ones in line to do that. So I could go on and on here. I'm kind of piling it on, but my point in emphasizing this is that we need to pick the things that demonstrate our love for neighbor, and our love for neighbor always begins with life. And I think subsidiary to this is an issue of freedom.
I'm just taking a note here, and I think that's a really helpful filter that I had not really thought of before. That kind of love for God and love for neighbor, and what that cuts against is love for myself and protection of myself and my subculture and kind of what I think is best and what I'm comfortable with. That's definitely a different dynamic, and I think a helpful filter for us. And so and then that last one, deep roots of belief weather storms, what we've been talking about the whole time, is helping the local church make disciples who are firmly rooted in the word, and even us making sure that's a part of our lives. Of course, most of us as Christians heard our Sunday school teacher or somebody, your parents, say, hey, you need to read your Bible every day, and you need to pray, and you need to go to church. And so my entire life were kind of like, yeah. But no, everybody listening, that's huge. That is the foundation that you're going to need to weather the storm that we're now facing. And so your Sunday school teacher was right in that sense. You need to make sure that happens. And so, Mark, I appreciate your perspective. For listeners, what I appreciate about your teaching is these truths, but also you can tell that for all these years you've been applying them not just inside of a Christian bubble, but to academia, to real life examples of students that may have no connection to faith and how to navigate those. So I just find your teaching very, very practical as we're trying to navigate this. And so you mentioned markeckel.com. Is that the best place for people to find you, and how can they get a hold of your teachings?
So yes, markeckel.com would be the first place I would say to go. You could go to warpandwoof.org. That's warpandwoof.org. That was the personal website I developed back in 2008. As I've mentioned already, we're transitioning. But you can always email me if you have a question. Feel free. My email is Eckel1957. That's ECKEL 1957 at Gmail. And I'll be happy to interact with folks as I'm able.
Appreciate it, Mark. And any final thoughts as we close up this episode on how to respond to marginalization?
Read 1 Peter, and specifically read 1 Peter 2:13-17. In fact, let me just read the last verse for everybody. If there was ever a meme in the Second Testament, this is it. Okay. Here is your Second Testament, New Testament meme. 1 Peter 2:17. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. I cannot think of any more basic idea than this that should drive us to help us to understand how to encounter this cultural moment.
Well, Mark, I appreciate your work. Thanks for taking some time today to talk to us about this topic.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Josh.